Okay, I believe the YouTube stream is live.
Okay, I'm still seeing starting soon.
Yeah, it should flip in a sec.
There it is.
And do we have audio working? And is the video okay on YouTube? Ah, the video is a bit screwed up. Okay, give me a sec. Okay, I
All good.
believe the YouTube stream is live. Let's see. I don't know why the size is off.
Oh,
Let me see.
it's like the OBS part.
Yeah, I should be able to get this working.
You see. Very good.
All right.
But,
All right, can you guys now see the complete picture in YouTube? I'll give it a sec for the stream to sync.
I see it moving. There it goes.
It certainly is moving.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. And boom, there we go. Lag time. All right. So I think we'll go ahead and get it started now. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. Morning or evening, whichever you're in. My name is Josh Lehman, also known as Laura Podlex. I'm our interim director of the Urbit Foundation, also known as Urbit.org. And I'm really happy to announce our very first event in the Urbit event series, and our new reborn developer calls. I want to introduce Lane, who's on this call up at the top. Lane is a member of our community, a contributor who proposed the event series via our grants program. And so we're really happy to have Lane putting this together. This is the start of it, which is a developer call, which will be followed by many more developer calls. Eventually there will be a town hall, all leading up to sometime early next year, a Urbit conference. More details on that to follow as we work them out. So I'm going to hand it over to Lane and let him go ahead and introduce this call.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Josh. Cool. Yeah, so I'm Lane Redig, otherwise known as Naplet Hildek on Urbit. I am pretty new to the Urbit community, so most of you probably have no idea who I am, which is cool. In my day job, I am a blockchain developer. I spent some time working as a core developer on Ethereum, and I now do R&D on a new blockchain project called Space Mesh. So that's the day job. Yeah, and as Josh alluded to, this is a new event series. I'm really, really excited to kick this off with this first event today with Logan talking about GraphStore. Thank you, everyone, for making time to join us. And I'm really thankful to Josh and to the Urbit.org Grants Initiative for supporting this project and this initiative and this event. As Josh mentioned, I'm a random dude in the community here in Urbit. And so I would encourage anyone else listening to this, whether on the live event, live stream, or watching a recording later, to submit a grant application because Josh and the team have been very supportive. And I think that there's a lot of other amazing stuff that can be born out of the community through that initiative. So yeah, this is a grassroots community initiative. I keep saying that, but I want to reemphasize that fact. There will be other future events. We hope to do these developer calls approximately every 2 weeks. There will be a larger town hall event next month, and hopefully also a larger conference style event or series of events sometime early next year. And we'll need help with all of those. So if you're interested in presenting work you've been doing or nominating someone to present or just helping out in one of many different ways, please reach out. The best way to do that is probably in the events series notebook and chat in Urbit community in Landscape. So this call obviously is being recorded and will be made available on urbit.org after the event is over. We'll do the same for all the future events. And just in terms of the format today, it's pretty straightforward. I'll hand things over to Logan in just a moment, and he will present on GraphStore. We'll leave plenty of time for Q&A. And as you've probably heard us chattering about here, there are several places where you can drop questions. One is the YouTube comment box if you're watching on YouTube. Another is that events series chat, again, in Urbit Community and Landscape. And then a third option is here in the webinar. I'm not certain if the chat feature is working. We'll play with that as Logan presents, but there's definitely a Q&A feature here. And this software is new to all of us, so apologies. We haven't worked out all the quirks yet. At the end of the hour, we will stop the recording and we will transition into a more casual sort of happy hour style format for anyone who wants to stick around. And obviously, if you can't stick around at that point, that's fine. And we'll unmute everyone and just it'll be a free-for-all. That'll be fun. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Logan and hand the presentation over to him. Takrit Sakrip, is that right? That's your Urbit ID, I think. Logan is an engineer on the interface team at Tlon. He focuses on user space infrastructure, and he designed and implemented GraphStore, which is a really important and exciting new piece of infrastructure in the Urbit stack. So, Logan, take it away.
All right, everyone. So can you see my presentation? I switched over to presenting. Lane, do you think they can see it? Okay, you can. Perfect. All right. Well, in that case, my name is Logan Allen, and I'm also Takrit Sokrip on the Urbit network. And I've been working at Tlon for the past 2.5 years or so. And it's been a lovely time. Love the team, love everybody. And since we've started really trying to make Landscape a serious product a few years ago, we've tried a lot of different approaches to building out user space applications that run in Urbit. And over time, we had started with a monolith that didn't quite do everything we needed it to do and was kind of built in the more early days of Urbit around command line applications. It was called Hall. And then we transitioned to a more services-based architecture where we had different application databases that were specific to them. So chat, store, publish, linked store, things along those lines. But then I realized that there was a lot of boilerplate that we had been writing over and over again, and a lot of inconsistencies that were similar across these different applications that had been presenting problems, and a lot of duplicated code overall. And I realized that we could actually represent all of the current applications that we had on Urbit in more or less a more constrained version of the data structure that Twitter supports, which is more or less infinitely threaded discussion with the ability for those threads to cross-reference each other. So a graph. And so I thought, I think that we could probably roll up a lot of these services into one single, more coherent service that we can then extend and use for even more use cases. Thus was GraphStore born. So I'll start at the broadest level of what we're doing at Urbit, and then I'll kind of get more specific into what I've been doing in GraphStore, since this is more or less meant for anyone who's already a developer, not just people that are already deep into the sphere, one might say. So what is Arvo? Arvo is the Urbit OS, and it's a purely functional virtual machine that takes in events as input. So in other words, it at any time has some particular state, and it's not processing anything other than when it receives an event. And that event could be received from an HTTP server. It could be received from another Urbit on the network via a peer-to-peer packet. It could be that you type something into the terminal or that a timer fires, but any of these things will be processed as an event, which gives us a very standard way to serialize and deserialize data into and out of the Urbit, and a very standard event flow for determining what your Urbit is doing at any point in time. So that gives us really, really nice debugging tools and really nice capability to actually try to make what your Urbit does deterministic and extremely stable over time. So Urbit, of course, is a very, very small stack, and we rewrote all of the stack in order to achieve the goal of making a personal server operating system. So an operating system that anyone could use to run a personal server for all of the needs that they may have, whether it's hosting a website, a blog, running a CMS, or doing sales, or just chatting with their friends, whatever it is. All of those things would normally require a personal server or someone else running a server for you. And so we want it to be so easy to run a personal server that you don't have to ask other people to run servers for you. So the basic model of the Arvo event loop is that it's a function, pure function, that takes in as input the previous state of your Urbit and a new event, and then returns the new state of your Urbit and a list of new events. Of course, the list would be empty. So Arvo, this is a nice diagram I stole from urbit.org, but Arvo can be considered as being divided into two things: the kernel space, so the base system utilities, such as timers, file system, terminal, HTTP server, application sandbox, so a place for dynamic user written code to run, and user space. So user space in this case actually lives inside of Gall, which is this application sandbox, so this application runtime environment. And so kernel space is, of course, the overall product that's purely technical. It's just meant for people to slowly make it more stable and to do research on, such that over time it can become more useful for actual product and use cases. And then, of course, user space is where we have been trying to build out services that can be generically useful, and also build out a specific software suite for people to be able to use and experience Urbit today, regardless of whether they're technical or not. And so we call that landscape. And so we're trying to make that an actual product. Then landscape, of course, uses user space infrastructure, which is primarily what I work on. So GraphStore is a user space application that runs as a application or Gall agent on your Urbit. And so it runs inside this application sandbox or application runtime, and it's a long-running service. And Landscape now uses it for almost everything. So let's see. So what is a Gall agent? I know I was throwing that word around. So it has a command query responsibility segregation. In other words, it treats commands or writes or changes to its data as being a separate thing from queries. And it has an event-driven architecture because it lives within Arvo. And it more or less functions as a long-running microservice that has its own database, and that can responsively react to commands or to subscriptions. So you could subscribe to the data, you can query the data, or you can change the data via specified logic that's been written in the Gall agent. So these microservices, or services in general, are the building blocks that we make all of the Urbit applications and Urbit landscape experience out of. So GraphStore is a specific one of these services, and it is a non-relational database with highly flexible schemas. So what does that mean? It's more or less that it's the Firebase of Urbit. In other words, you can have a very simple tool that lets you get started using Urbit without actually having to write any Hoon. You can write clients to this database that insert data into it in various ways and that manage their own graphs without needing to write Hoon. You could do it in JavaScript. I think some people are working on it in Python and Go and Swift as well. just being able to treat this database as any other server and just send it requests, subscribe to its data, and reactively update an application based off of it. So it is called Graph Store because it is actually a graph, but it's more similar to MongoDB than it is to Neo4j. So you're not constructing custom graph queries that run by executing graphs. Rather, it supports a graph data structure. So how would it support a graph data structure that has cycles and things along those lines, given that Nock is a binary tree language, so it cannot support cycles. So we support them as virtual cycles. And so what that means is that any individual node in the graph could reference another node. But overall, the best way to think of this is just as something equivalent to MongoDB. It's generically useful. It's not best for everything, so data that's highly relational or whatever, but you can very easily write validation schemas that force the data in any particular graph to fit to your schema, which is super useful when you're writing a specific use case like we have with chat, where we don't have threaded discussion, or something else. So the internals of GraphStore are quite simple. GraphStore stores graphs, and those are trees of nodes that are ordered by numeric key in descending order. So it's an ordered map of nodes. It's not just a map or not just a list. And so it's ordered by descending order because the latest or most recent nodes are the ones that are first, because GraphStore is optimized for social media applications, whether that's chat, forums, Twitter equivalents, etc. So generally in those types of applications, you would like to see your data sorted with the most recent ones first, so that you're seeing what's happening now. And so that's the way that we store the data, because of course you don't want to be sorting it all the time to be in the opposite order if you already have it in the order that you want. So each node contains a data structure called a post, which contains content and other things. And then it contains another graph, which of course could be empty, but that graph is all of the children of that node. So it's any replies that are to the node or equivalents to that. So of course you could have different semantic meanings to children, but generally we would best think of those as replies or replies to replies, etc. So the internals of a post. A post, of course, is the primary data structure that contains content in a node. Post, of course, is an arbitrary term. It just has a semantic that implies the kind of use case that we would expect of these tools. So of course, GraphStore is optimized for social data, and given that that's the case, we're going to refer to the content as a post. So it contains a list of contents, which we'll get more into later. It contains metadata about the post, so who authored the post, what time was it sent, things along those lines. It contains a half SHA-256 hash called a sham, which we primarily picked this because 128 bits is just more space efficient than 256 bits. And we wanted something that was relatively cheap, that we could hash all of the content and metadata of the post with, that we could then sign with your AIMS private key. So your AIMS is the peer-to-peer protocol that we use for our network. And we want to be able to actually verify all of the data that's in a post. So as an example, part of the data that's hashed is actually the hash of the parent of the post. So if you're replying to someone, the actual reply itself, the metadata about the reply, including that you were replying to some particular post, will all be hashed, and then you can sign that, which allows you to attest to the validity of the post. In other words, GraphStore has a capability to have a sort of immutable data where data cannot be modified, but it can be appended to. So you could append more revisions to it, but you can't actually delete data that goes into the graph, which is a very powerful feature. And not only that, of course, you can have not only you, but other people attest or sign the content that you've posted. And so that gives you the ability to have some equivalent of likes that are cryptographically verified, or you could of course apply other semantics like legal signatures or things along those lines. So this is very useful because often in the current schema within Urbit, we have a single host of a group who runs a chat room or a blog or something along those lines for a whole group of people. And of course, AIMS, our peer-to-peer protocol, does do public key, private key encryption on any packet that gets sent from one person to another and verifies the validity of that. But if I post to Josh's blog a comment and you're subscribed to it, you don't just want to know that the packet that you received from Josh was received from him. You want to know that the comment that I made is actually verified as by me and not just something that Josh made up. And so GraphStore lets us do that. So I mentioned that I was going to tell you about the actual contents of posts. And so that's what we have here. I know if you're not familiar with looking at Hoon, it's maybe a little intimidating, but this is just a tagged union. So it's more or less a switch over various potential types. So as I mentioned, any post contains a list of content. So you can have multiple content in here that are in some order. And so you could have text, you can have mentions of other ships, which will be really useful for our notifications feature, which we're rolling out soon. You can have URLs, and you can have executable code with the output. And as I mentioned, you can refer to other GraphStore nodes, which gives you the equivalent of a retweet or of a link to another part of the graph. So you, of course, see the to-do statement in here. And so it's likely that we will at some point actually allow dynamic data to go into the graph as well. So we call those cages in Urbit. And so, of course, everything in Urbit is strongly typed unless you put it into what's called a vase. And a cage is a pair of a mark, which is an executable file type, and a vase, which is this untyped container. And so GraphStore will likely support content to a post. Appending data to some like shared conception of what you're seeing. So like feeds, Pinterest type stuff, arena type stuff, all of that is great for GraphStore. It might even be good for Google Docs, etc. once we make revisions more of a first party citizen, but I'm not sure. Things that it's not really suitable for: relational data. If you have to think about joins of your data or anything like that, or unique indices other than the date that it was posted, etc., it's probably not a good fit for GraphStore. And then well-structured data, really anything that you would want actual features of SQL for, you don't want GraphStore. GraphStore is, of course, much more similar to MongoDB than it is to SQL. So you're not going to want to put calendars in here or geographic data. GraphStore is not meant to replace all application databases. It's just meant to work for social data. Of course, we might have SQL equivalents written as stores in the future, which would be amazing, that are good for relational data. Um, we don't have them yet. If you're interested in working on them, please message me on Urbit. All right, so opening things up for Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Logan. That was super cool. Can you see and hear me okay?
I can certainly hear you.
Very cool. Right. Yeah, we have a few audience questions. Let me just kick off with one or two of my own. Oh, I lost your video.
I just turned it back on.
Okay, there we go. Cool. Yeah, no, thank you again. This is super educational and super exciting. Could you tell us a little bit more about the sort of design and development process that went into GraphStore? Like, how did you figure out how to
Sure.
design it? What was it inspired by? How long did it take? What was the hardest part? Any of those things?
Sure. So I figured out how to make it in December of 2019, at least an approximation of how to make it. I figured out that I needed to make something that more or less reflected the same data structure that Twitter has, because Twitter is in fact the most flexible of the social media sites. So of course that doesn't mean 180 character limits or 140 or whatever it is, but what it does mean is that you can have infinitely threaded discussion that is presenting different types of media and that can cross-reference data from other threads. So that's extremely important if you want to support any type of social communication. Like an email is a special case of that, a forum is a special case of that. All of these things are special cases of generic threaded data. And I saw again and again that our user space team was tackling the same issues, presenting slightly differently because of differences in architecture between our different applications. So like, how do you handle invites? Well, chat had to do it, publish had to do it, links had to do it. We have an invite utility, but they each had to have their own individual boilerplate that would stick that together. And how would you handle subscriptions? How would you handle all these different things? Like making sure your data structure was performant, making sure that there was enough queries on it so you could get the different types of pagination we want. We kept having to handle these same things over and over, and it started to really make sense to me to look for an abstraction that I could use to represent all of them, so that we could have a single nice implementation of it that we could then extend and just slap some type of validation schema on and make it nicer. So I thought of it really in December, but I was thinking about using lists because we didn't have the ordered map utility in the standard library yet, which is actually extremely essential to doing this type of data in a performant way, because you want to be able to have login lookup times of any individual node, and you want login insertion, login deletion. Whereas with a list, and of course you want something like 2 login subsets as well. And so within a list, you end up having a linear subset. You actually get I think you get about linear insertion too, and linear deletion, which all of this is horrible. And so really the implementation I was looking at in December was pretty bad because of that, because we didn't have this nice utility. But Ted ended up making the ordered map utility for AIMS right around that time. And so then when I was looking at this problem again in March of this year, it was clear that I needed to use ordered map, and that ordered map would work perfectly for my needs if I just added some utility methods to it. So I worked on ordered map quite a bit and added subsetting functionality and some nice methods that maps and sets have. And I also added a mold constructor so that we can actually have validated ordered maps which we didn't have before. We were just representing them as trees, which of course they're still trees, but now they're trees validated by the type system. We call them MOPs.
So much fun terminology to get up to speed with in Urbit. This is great, very educational. You talked a little bit about, towards the end, the things that GraphStore is good for and less good for, and a little bit about schemas and kind of SQL versus NoSQL and relational and things like that. If I am an application developer and I'm thinking about building something for Urbit and I want to use GraphStore, what advice do you have for me in terms of like how I should be structuring data, thinking about schemas, that kind of thing?
The main thing that I would say is really, really consider whether you actually need a Gall agent or not. You probably don't need a Gall agent. You probably just need a thread, which is a script that is a monad, which runs either upon instantiation or now can run upon receiving subscription events. Because of a utility I wrote called the thread watch hook, which lets you subscribe to data. So you could, for instance, subscribe to a graph. And then anytime you receive new updates to the graph, you could then perform some action. So maybe that action is you want to post it to Twitter. And so you want to take in anything that's posted to the graph and you want to send an HTTP request. Anything like that you could do with these threads. So I would say you probably don't need a Gall application, depending on what you're doing. You could probably use threads and just use GraphStore to store data in. And I would also say that there's really, really a rich area that's really unexplored right now, which is just building different types of interfaces to these graphs where you're interacting with them differently. Like if you wanted to build a forum for landscape, you wouldn't need to write anyhoon. You could do it completely in whatever language you already know and just store it in GraphStore. So I would say that should be explored a ton because it was previously not possible.
Awesome. Bless you. And yeah, thank you. It's exciting to hear that GraphStore should make the lives of developers easier. Hey there, Josh, did you have community questions for us or anything?
I do. I did have one question related to the one you were just discussing. You'd mentioned that there are certain kinds of data that are not suitable for GraphStore, like geographic or calendar, or anything really well-structured and well-defined. If you had some well-defined data like that and you wanted to expose a social layer on it, is there any way to combine the GraphStore with some other custom Gall agent and build some kind of way for the two to communicate so that you get kind of the best of both?
Sure, yeah. So you could certainly hook it up such that people could chat about a calendar or leave comments on a calendar or put comments on a map or something. You could just arrange your keys such that maybe you'd make a new entry to the graph every time you make a new geolocation spot on the map. And you just do that automatically in your Gall application. And then the comments, of course, could only be replies to that initial node. So you could do it pretty simply with just a schema on GraphStore and then some other application sitting out.
Great, thank you. I do have a couple of questions that I'm going to field from the community that I've seen. One came in via Urbit from Ronreg Ribdev about interacting with data via other languages. I want to know if there's any guide on getting started with that. I know we have, there are actually, I can address a little part of that, which is that we have kind of an overall initiative to enable this kind of behavior. You may have heard of it, it's called Erloc. There's a project that I've seen called ErlocPy. There are a few other libraries that have been written in this vein. And the idea is that Erloc is really just an interface to the HTTP API of Urbit. And so if you have access to a Gall agent's state, that you can access via HTTP, which you can through all of them, then wrappers could be built around this. As a work in progress right now, there are libraries being worked on in TypeScript. There's one in Swift. There's a new one that came out recently in Go that is currently under review. And I know there are more. I may be missing them, but we would also love contributions in this space. If you are wanting to contribute a way to communicate with Graphstore, start learning how to do it, this would be a really high value way to start working on Grant's work, is to build out interfaces to Graphstore. Any comments on that, Logan?
Yeah, I mean that's all true. I don't really have I don't really have a lot to add to that.
I think we do have some documentation coming out about Graphstore somewhat soon as well.
Yeah, we had a couple of
you
community.
you can interact with all these external APIs via JSON. I think that Tyler Schuster may have finished working on his external API documentation already. I just don't see it anywhere on urbit.org. But I believe I saw the GitHub stuff get merged.
Yeah, I saw this yesterday.
Yeah,
I'll
maybe-
post it shortly.
Okay, good. Yeah, so there's a whole guide to doing this that just got written, and so yeah, we should just blast that out. I'll see if I can post it on my Twitter account, maybe.
We had a couple people ask about tutorials, guides, where to learn more, where to get started. So yeah, we can make sure that this video includes those links like down below in the information. I've got a couple other questions I wrote down here from community folks. I'll just go ahead and read a couple of them. So Logan, you had mentioned when you were talking about hashes and signatures that you use half SHA-256, right? So 128 bits. Could you talk about the choice of 128 bits, why that's the right number? And also, how hard would it be to transition to the full hash if necessary, or if for example, SHA-256 hypothetically were to get broken?
It would be easy to transition to different hashes. We could just make it a switch type. So in other words, make it so that we could support multiple hashes. There's not any reason why we would need to support one singular hash versus multiple hashes. Very easy to do that migration. 128 just seemed like the minimum viable to not be easily crackable. And I imagine that number is not perfect. It's just an arbitrary decision, and it's pretty easy to move off of it. So it's not I mean, if you made a pull request right now that supported multiple hashes and had all the utilities for signing these hashes and generating and validating them, like, I would accept it. So it's not a big deal.
Awesome. Another question from the chat channel on Urbit from Ronreg Ribdev. No, I think this is half trolling, half tongue-in-cheek, half serious. The question is, when is Urbit going to support SQL? And I'm bringing this up, Logan, because it's something that we had sort of spoken about previously.
Sure. So like I'm like different people have different opinions about this. I personally am completely for Urbit supporting something similar to SQL. I think that we could actually do way better than SQL, because we have a very strongly typed language for representing these queries. And I think that would be extremely powerful and would be way nicer in practice to use than SQL, actually. I mean, we would have like compile time type validation on it, which would be fantastic. So I would say there's no plans right now, but it's something that we're open to. I mean, as you guys are aware, like, we have created a new VM that builds things from a very bare bones way, but I don't think that excludes us using patterns that work. Some people may disagree, but personally, I think you don't have to be big brain about everything. So yeah, SQL, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, another good question here from Lagrev Nokfep. Will there be access, permissions, or validation on data elements, or is this sort of like just running sudo all the time?
Okay, that's a great question. So The data permissioning is actually done at the hook level, not at the store level. So I know we haven't talked about these today, but stores are just still data. It's a database, and hooks are moving data or networking or automation or anything like that. So in this case, what I'm talking about is I'm talking about the layer that validates and applies permissions to the peer-to-peer communication of graph data between ships. So the hooks already actually do apply a basic permission scheme to graphs. So first off, you can't subscribe to someone else's graph unless you are in their group and have permission to access it. Or they may have an open group, in which case you can access it. And also, you may not remove other people's data unless you are the host of that graph. So if the graph is on your computer, you can remove it. But you can't remove it if it's on someone else's computer unless you're the person that posted that entry to the graph in the first place. So that is the current permission scheme. As we improve our support for third-party applications and third-party clients, etc., we would like to introduce a capabilities system to our GAL application runtime so that you can actually provide so that you can actually limit the usage or the ability for a client to access more than one of your graphs or things along those lines. And we haven't built it yet, but we're all in agreement that a capabilities system is the right way to go about this type of security. But for now, if you're running something third party, run it at your own risk. Good luck.
Always good advice. Ronreg Vibdev asked, or sort of commented, I'm interested in the distinction between threads and GAL agents for application developers, which of course you spoke about a moment ago, Logan. They said, as far as I know, if you want to have a pane in landscape that does anything, you need a GAL agent, if only to serve the specific HTML associated with your pane. Does that sound accurate to you? Do you have anything to add to that?
No, so that's not accurate. So that was accurate as of March, but it's not accurate as of May. So land page. Okay, no, landscape is a single page application now. And we do in fact want to add the ability to dynamically load in other JS modules, but we will not need any GAL application code to serve those JS modules because we have a generic GAL application that can serve anything, which is file server. So file server obsoletes the need for you to write a GAL agent that will serve your HTML or JS because you could just use file server. And so you don't need it for that. If you're storing your data in GraphStore, you don't need the GAL agent to store your data. And the main difference between a thread and a GAL agent is that a thread is a lighter weight version of a GAL agent. So it can still respond to pokes, it can still respond to timer events, still respond to all these things, but it's much more difficult to store state in a thread. You can, but you probably, if you're storing heavy duty state like databases and stuff, you don't want to put that in a thread. So if you're storing your data in GraphStore and you're not doing anything else, you don't need a GAL application. You can use a thread, or you could just use a client where you're talking to it via JS. And you won't need any Hoon code to put another module in landscape or to serve your application if it's not in landscape.
Another question from Foster Soulfire. Question is there the notion of a node/post type somewhere so that the reader can figure out which kind of node they're dealing with? For example, infer what contents that node is expected to have or what the subgraph is expected to contain. Or is this just implicit in where the node is in the graph?
Yeah, okay. So this is a great question. So this information is stored based on the mark of the graph. So every graph is marked. So it has a validation mark that defines the graph's schema. And you can find those validators in /mar/graph chat/validator. There are currently 3. There's one for chat, publish, and link. So each one of those will apply a different validation schema to the node based on its location in the graph. So it is, if you're just looking at the graph and you're not thinking about the validator, it is implicit to the graph. But in the mark validator, it is explicit, and it is based on its position in the graph. There's only one type of node. There's not multiple types, so it's all generic. And so the only thing that's differentiating them is how you're validating it.
Great. Another question from the same person. This is sort of a follow-up, but does the metadata on the post include the context of where the message was sent? For example, chat. His understanding is that contents-less metadata is what signatures will apply to. So if such context is not there, you could take a message from chat A and put it on chat B, and no one would actually notice.
So in chat, you can do that, yes. Because you do not have a parent signature that you are replying to. So because chat is a single level conversation and it's not a threaded conversation, you can in fact take something from one chat and put it in another chat, yes. However, you wouldn't be able to change the timestamp. So you wouldn't be able to insert it in wherever you wanted in the conversation. But yeah, you can, if someone sends you data, you can repost it and everyone will be able to see it.
Cool. Same user here, Fostire Sulfire. I'm still learning how to pronounce Urbit IDs. Foster Sulfur added a comment as well and said there's a project called perkeep, perkeep.org. Logan, are you familiar with this? It
No.
aims to be the, quote, persistent storage for backing up everything social, end quote. And that might have some good insights on schema handling and mapping various kinds of app data into a general graph-like data. So that might be worth taking a look at if you're not already familiar with it.
Okay, yeah, sounds interesting.
And I have a really interesting question here from John Chavez in the webinar. Let me find the question. John asked, I will read
in
this.
the webinar, using the webinar features.
Yeah, we're juggling a bunch of different channels here. So Logan, you mentioned supporting any data type in GraphStore. I'm wondering if you can elaborate on what types you're looking into supporting and how the different data types may affect the public key crypto validation. Are there any concerns about the inputs to the hash function for different data types? Does this relate to the different data types that may not be supported in GraphStore?
So first off, that's a great question. And in the normal world, this would be an extreme concern. The wonderful answer that I'm happy to give you is that no, it doesn't matter because we're actually hashing the noun, and nouns are the same regardless of whether they're typed or untyped. They're just natural numbers arranged in binary trees, and we're just hashing it. So it doesn't matter, which is great. It's a sensible question, but we just don't have to care, which is nice.
It's always a good answer.
All right. I've got another question. It's a bit of a long one.
Okay.
I'm gonna do my best to sort of articulate this, but this comes in from Little Wolfer, who is one of our more prolific community developers, and he's got a lot of thoughts on the intersection of online gaming and Urbit.
Okay.
And so he's thinking about a use case in which GraphStore could potentially be used. And this is broken down into a series of about 5 parts. So let me try and get through this.
I'm going to see if I can
okay,
even
so
find.
it's in the event
where
series
is
discussion channel,
Event
which I think not everyone can
Okay,
see
I'm
on the
joining.
screen. So I'll kind of run through these.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Cool.
so the first part,
yeah,
so
please
what
read
you're
it out
thinking
loud.
about is this external database that's holding game state for an online game. And so the first part is that a game server would pull the database and find that the player has recently acquired some new item. Next, on our game server, we construct a graph node that holds the item's UUID as a reference in the post, hashes the JSON representation of the item and the time it was acquired, and then puts that in the node under the inventory node in that player's graph. All right. Next, we'd send the JSON representation, the UUID and the time acquired, to a game client that's running on the player's ship. There's a little note here about whether or not pull push hooks are necessary, but we can come back to that. Next, the player's ship would update its graph, which would mirror the graph on the server ship, but additionally holds the JSON in the text of content post. So I think we're storing serialized JSON as text in the post. And then finally, since the reconstructed hash should still match the game server's graph, P2P trading can happen outside of the game safely, which is actually pretty interesting. Because a hash mismatch would result in a rejected trade. And then as far as he knows, the server ship would maintain a group for all the players, and then updates would be sent to the player ship as signed by the server, and then the player wouldn't be able to update the graph manually. Does that seem like the kind of use case that GraphStore would enable?
Okay, great. So that's a very good question. Okay, so first off, yes, it does actually work for this. I'm glad that the signature hashing, update log, and archiving functionality is useful for you. However, I don't think you should be storing the JSON representation of the item in the graph. Rather, I think that we should just chat about how soon we could get vases into GraphStore, because I think that this is a situation where you actually do want typed data for these items. And I think it does make sense to put the node under the inventory node. That the way that you're using GraphStore makes complete sense. It just, the way that you're actually storing the data in the posts that requires this degree of serialization is unpleasant. I would not recommend it. I would say that as for the pull push hook question about is pull push hook necessary to be used here, yes. In order to access this data, you will want to use the graph push pull hook, but you won't have to write your own hooks. I think that you could just use them as is, as long as you have the proper group permissioning and you're making graphs when you need them. But yeah, I mean, it works perfectly for this use case because you don't have relational data. You're just storing stuff, basically.
Sweet. Well, that's really helpful. I think that, and then WikDev is commenting on this in Urbit as well, on that it should be fairly easy for vases to be added into GraphStore because the GraphStore doesn't actually care about what this was.
Correct.
I know you had mentioned that there are some reasons why this hasn't yet been done.
Philip talked about this yesterday, actually, and there's nothing stopping us from doing it. We can just do it. I was worried that there would be a space leak from storing vases, but I don't think that is the case. So yeah, we could just do it.
Well, there we go.
Super exciting. That's a really crazy, cool use case idea, and it just shows how flexible this GraphStore design is and the sort of the power that it has to be able to be used in totally ways that have nothing to do with the original Twitter design.
Their own documentation.
I've got one final question from the community here, and then I'll maybe ask one final question, and then I think it'll be the top of the hour. But Josh, if you have any other burning ones here from the community, feel free to jump in as well. Foster Sulfur has a follow-up to the question, Logan, that you answered a couple minutes ago about contents and metadata and what signatures apply to. And the question is, could we fix that issue in chat schema, for example, by including the channel or something else in the metadata?
No. So we don't want to include the channel in the metadata. It's not necessary. But what we could do is we could fix it in the chat schema by making a single post in the chat at the time when the channel was created, and then having all of the conversation then happen as the children of that post. So in other words, you don't need to store way more information in every node, but you can still have that validation of the parent, which would be made at the time that the chat was made. And so, yeah, the hashes wouldn't mash up between chats. Yeah. But overall, the general problem is not solvable. If you want to privately communicate data to someone that they can decrypt and put into plain text format, they can transmit it to someone else. Once you put it on their server, they can do whatever they want with it. So the general problem is not solvable. But the specific thing that we're discussing about easily cross-posting in a way that is not discernible that it was cross-posted is solvable. Yes. Yeah, so if you're interested in contributing, go to GitHub, make an issue, comment on an issue, make a pull request, message me or Matilda, Hadef Sidwin on the network. We're happy to help you get started. Email us, logan@talon.io, matilda@talon.io. What was the other part?
I guess
That's how you contribute.
Yeah, how to contribute, how to learn more, where to find you. I think you probably answered all those questions.
Okay, great.
Super cool.
Yeah, this is Josh here. My network dropped out, which is why I'm glad I connected via phone. So still here. But just on that note, also, if you have a project you'd like to work on, if you'd like to work on something airlock related for infrastructure around connecting to an Urbit ship from another language, or if you have a thing you'd like to build and you're curious about whether or not Rapstor would be a good fit, feel free to reach out to me, josh@urbit.org, and I'd be happy to work with you on architecture implementation and guide you through making a proposal if you've got an idea. Cool.
Amazing. All right. Thank you both very much. Thanks, everyone, for joining the webinar today, posting great questions and comments, and everyone who watched this video as well. So I'm Lane Reddig. I'm Naplet Hildek on Urbit, so feel free to message me, to DM me there. I'm also L Rettig on Twitter. That's another good place to find me. If you have ideas for future events, if you would like to speak yourself, if you'd like to nominate someone else to speak, if you have ideas for our town hall event in December, if you have ideas for UrbitCon, we don't really have a working name for it yet, but for whatever that event or event series will look like early next year, reach out. And then again, as a reminder, there's an events series chat and a notebook in Urbit Community in Landscape, so you can find us there. Thank you, everybody, again. We will see you back here in 2 weeks for the second call in the developer call series. Have a great day.